Greetings. Thank you guys for tuning in for another video. Trust that you're glad to see me as I'm glad to see you. So, wanted to share some thoughts and opinions on yet another remarkable Russian literary classic, War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. And I suspect this is going to be the longest book review I've had to date, because this is, I think, the longest novel I've read to date. And for those of you who aren't aware with the sheer size of this, if you've never seen or held the book in person, to sort of give you a point of reference, this is what it looks like next to my head. So anyway, needless to say, I spent a considerable amount of time reading this book, and also a considerable amount of time thinking about what to say about it. And to be clear, my motivation for making this video is to encourage and motivate as many people as possible to at least consider exploring the book at some point in life. Maybe not immediately, but I do think that it is one of the most relevant books, especially today, especially for Americans today, to read and to discuss, moreover. And so anyway, without further ado, no more prefacing, no more introductions. Let me go ahead and just dive right into this. So, in my opinion, War and Peace can be split into two separate parts. On the one hand, you have a historical fiction novel. You have a story that is set in Europe between 1805 and 1820 or so in a macro sense. Then in a micro sense, the setting is Russia, okay? Because the main characters are Russian. And then on the other hand, you have interspersed throughout this story these breaks and intermissions that contain the thoughts and reflections, ideas, and remarks of Tolstoy on the subject of history. And so the most important aspect of this book is the subject of history itself. And what Tolstoy, I think, is trying to accomplish in combining these two parts is to communicate something very profound about the subject of history, the way we view it, especially, and the way we discuss it. It struck me at some point that Tolstoy could have very well written the story without including any of his remarks or reflections and thoughts and ideas interspersed throughout it. But again, it seems as though he was being very deliberate about communicating something that he could not do otherwise, or at least, I guess, clarifying it in a way that made his position as clear as possible, perhaps. So if you're fresh on your history, you probably recall that this period of Europe's history was fairly tumultuous. There was a lot going on. You may recall that the events that led up to France's conflict with Russia, which began in 1805 formally with the Battle of Austerlitz, that this conflict, the events that led up to it, were things that were going on in France. There was a social and political revolution that we now refer to as the French Revolution. And out of the midst of all this chaos and conundrum arose a man who to this day is shrouded in infamy and notoriety. In many ways, he is like Donald Trump. Regardless of whether you love him or whether you hate him, no one can deny his fame or reputation or influence with respects to history, world history. You may have already guessed that the man I speak of is Napoleon Bonaparte. And there are so many interesting facts about Napoleon, one of which is the fact that he wasn't even French. He was not like a native Frenchman. He was born on the island of Corsica to Corsican parents, immigrated to France at a rather young age, and was educated there. And during the French Revolution, enlisted in the army, and by some epic twist of fate, had one of the most epic from rags to riches stories ever told. He climbs his way through the ranks and has repeated success on the battlefield and gains this reputation of being this military mastermind, this tactical genius. And this all culminates in 1804 whenever he's crowned Emperor of France. And so anyway, I say all this to say the way that Napoleon is often depicted and the way that the events that accompanied his life are always depicted, especially the events between 1805 and 1812, as we will see in this book. They're often always ascribed, mostly if not entirely, to Napoleon. Like the historical accounts that people write about this period in history is, well, all of these things happened ultimately because of Napoleon's ambition, because of his grandeur, because of his skill as a military strategist. They say that the way that things transpired ultimately fall back onto Napoleon, the will of Napoleon. And this is precisely what Tolstoy seeks to challenge, not just with respects to this particular period in history, but also with respects to the way we talk about history in general. It goes without saying that history is a subject that is, well, subject to subjectivism. That is, it is very prone to being infiltrated with the bias and partiality of those who craft the narratives. Okay? And this is like common sense, right? Like, I think the age-old adage, is that history is always written by the victors, or something along those lines. And so Tolstoy discovered, while he was researching for the writing of this book, he discovered that French historians often have this tendency to exaggerate the greatness of Napoleon, the skill of Napoleon, the genius of Napoleon, and even when it's revealed that Napoleon had certain faults and made certain mistakes and has flaws, those aspects of his character are downplayed. On the other hand, Russian historians have a tendency to exaggerate the unity and the solidarity and the enduring character of the Russian people. What Tolstoy found was that if you look at historical manuscripts and correspondences, you see that a lot of these generalizations are just downright false. For example, with respects to France's invasion of Moscow in 1812, the Tsar Alexander was staunchly opposed to the abandoning of Moscow. Okay? He thought that Moscow should be defended down to the very last man. And the commander-in-chief, on the other hand, Kutuzov, thought that this would be ridiculous. This would be suicide. Kutuzov realized that attempting to fight the French at Moscow would only result in the needless loss of Russian lives that, at all things considered, they couldn't afford to lose. Okay, and so this is just one point that demonstrates that even at the highest echelons of Russia's society, there wasn't exactly a lot of unity and solidarity. The same thing can be seen in the depiction of the Battle of Austerlitz. The joint Austrian and Russian troops, soldiers, at one point during the battle, are being so whipped badly by the French that they end up turning on each other. They start accusing each other of being traitors. And this should not even surprise us, given the fact that the Austrian and Russian generals also didn't have a lot of unity between themselves. Kutuzov himself actually anticipated and predicted that the Battle of Austerlitz was going to be a complete disaster, and it was. Napoleon whooped the Austrians and the Russians. And so these are just a few examples of details and facts that often don't get mentioned in our depictions of, well, the stories that we call history. And all that is to say is that history is often fictionalized. Now, what this suggests is something which is very controversial and even inconvenient for a lot of us to accept. And that is that if it is true that, just for example, this one period of history that we're talking about is often subject to a lot of false opinions, then what else in history is subject to a lot of false opinions? You know, it's like, what else are we believing and thinking about that may potentially be misleading or false altogether? And that's one of the reasons why I say this book is extremely relevant for those of us alive today, especially in the United States, because it's my opinion that much of our cultural dysfunction and disunity in this country is directly due to the fact that we have, as a people, in a macro sense, just been very poorly educated in the subject of history. We don't really understand our history, and we don't understand the nuance and sophistication and complexities of our history. I should put it that way. Not to imply that most Americans are dumb people, that most Americans are uneducated people. No, That's merely to suggest that the reason why we often attack each other is because we don't really understand each other, if I can put it that simply. And the reason we don't understand each other is because we don't even understand the past. And so that's just one example of how I have seen the relevance of Tolstoy's novel, this book, in application in my life, and just thinking through the things that are going on in the 21st century in the United States. But anyway, I've kind of digressed a bit. Getting back to the book itself, I already sort of mentioned the setting. So it's set between 1805 and 1820 in Europe, and in a micro sense, it's set in Russia. One of the ways that Tolstoy wants to communicate about this period in history is by telling the fictional story, as I've already mentioned. And he does this by including a really large cast of characters. Now, it goes without saying that you shouldn't be surprised that a book of this size has so many characters. In fact, I think it has like well over 500, if not more. I'm not sure. I think I read somewhere it has 500 characters or so. But the point is that I think that Tolstoy was trying to subliminally communicate something with even that. And that is that a lot of these characters, obviously some are more prominent than others. Obviously some have a more significant and active role in the story than others. Some only appear for a single scene and then they're gone. You never see them again. Some make very brief reappearances and then they're gone. But the point is that every single person, from Napoleon all the way down to common soldiers and peasants and people belonging to the Russian nobility, everybody plays a role in the events of history. Everybody plays an active role and participates in what we inevitably call the past. Okay, and so Tolstoy takes a magnifying glass and puts it onto a certain class of people in this book, and that is the Russian aristocracy, and namely 4 families in particular. And those of you who are Russian speakers, please forgive me if I butcher the pronunciations. But the Bezhukovs, the Rostovs, the Bolkonskis, and the Kuragins. These are the main 4 families in the book whose lives are followed. And even more precisely, it is the young people of these families. Now, this is something which is kind of underrated about the book, which is that it's a book about young people. It's a book about people in the flower of their youth, people who are often depicted to be naive and unsuspecting about the harsh realities of life, people who come from privileged backgrounds, people who inevitably undergo personal revelations and evolutions and developments in their character and their attitudes and their beliefs and their values and their lifestyles. These are some of the most human characters that I personally have come across in literature. And as you might suspect, a book of this length, you get to become well acquainted with a lot of these characters and have an intimate understanding of them. And moreover, you see so many reflections of the human condition in them, and hence reflections of yourself, or at least I did. And so anyway, Tolstoy takes a magnifying glass to several of these characters' lives, and so we get to follow the progress of their lives, and we get to see how they're either affected or disaffected by the events and circumstances that transpired between 1805 and 1812 or so, and in the subsequent years in the epilogue. And so I'll go ahead and mention something else, which is that this book includes a variety of themes. In fact, I think the most amount of themes that I've seen in any other book, and again, unsurprisingly, it's because of the size of the book. The theme of war and peace, things about gain and loss, about sacrifice, about fear and cowardice, and courage and love and hope, about dreams and nightmares, about just really any and everything that you can think of that constitutes a really comprehensive and balanced life. Like, you see it all. And what I think is also subliminally communicated through this, the variety of themes, is that history itself is just one big messy concoction. It's like it contains all this stuff, and like we like to make these sweeping generalizations. We like to put things into neat categories to make sense out of everything, because it's convenient and it's easy, and sometimes it even suits our motives for communicating with others. But the real fact of the matter is that life is messy, man, and the interconnectedness of our stories about, I may be living in this remote place far, far away from you, but everything that transpires is just like a bunch of butterfly effects. Like, how can we calculate and account for everything that we do in our life and the effect that may have on someone else's life? It's just like, it's really mind-boggling to think about. This is one of those, it's really mind-boggling to think about, but I almost said something, but I'm not going to say it. Anyway, my point is that this book is it's so epic in its scope. It's epic in its themes. It's epic in its cast of characters and in the history itself and what it, in its coverage of history. Maybe, I'm trying to think, did I miss anything? Yeah. I wanted to make sure not to reveal any sort of spoilers about the book, because I didn't want to I didn't want to ruin it for anybody who's just interested in maybe learning some more about it, but doesn't want to, have the story ruined for them. So at this point, I'll just go ahead and talk about some of the challenges for reading the book, and also maybe some suggestions for reading it, or when to read it rather. Goes without saying that it's long. It's a considerable investment of time. I found that I got lost at certain points. Surprisingly, I got lost at certain points keeping up with certain geographical features, historical references, names. Names was a big one. A lot of Russian names. And another thing is a considerable amount of the book is written in French. Now, there are footnotes in this particular edition that I have. There's footnotes. I think in really every edition that includes the French, the original French, there's footnotes that include English translations. So anyway, just some really, a lot of things that I encountered in this book were like first timers for me. So I just think they're kind of worthy things to mention, things that are worthy of mention. And what else? Yeah, I guess that's about it. A ridiculously large cast of characters that's sometimes difficult to keep up with. I recommend, if you read this book, splitting it up into sections, and don't find a stopping place if possible until you reach the end of a chapter. Maybe that's probably the best recommendation I have, because if you stop prematurely and then you try to pick up where you left off, but yet it wasn't a really good starting place, well, then you're going to have to be scratching your head wondering, like, well, wait, hold up, what happened here and what happened there? And it's just that can consume a lot of your time. I speak from personal experience. That consumed quite a bit of my time. And if I certainly think that anybody who's interested in history would appreciate this book, especially if you're interested in the history of Europe, especially during this time. And also, guys, that's it. I'm really surprised that I didn't have more to say about this. Maybe I'm forgetting something crucial, but who knows? Anyway, till next time, you guys have a good one, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.